The flashing blue and red lights painted the quiet suburban street in frantic, silent strokes, washing over the hand-carved mailbox post that bore the name Carter. They bled through the living room window, splashing across the framed family photos on the mantelpiece. A smiling woman with kind eyes, a proud man beside her, a tiny baby in their arms. Kalen stood in the doorway of the home he had built with his own two hands, the cool night air raising goosebumps on his arms. He wasn't cold. He was hollowed out by a weariness so profound it felt like it had settled in his bones. Two police officers stood on his porch, their expressions a professional mixture of caution and duty. One had his hand resting near his sidearm, a gesture that sent a familiar, sickening jolt through Kalen's chest. He kept his own hands visible, palms open at his sides, just as his father had taught him. He was a tall black man in a world that often saw his height and skin as a threat before it saw his humanity. "Sir, we received a call about a trespasser at this address," the younger officer said, his voice tight. From the curb, a figure stepped out of a sleek, black sedan. Even in the strobing chaos of the police lights, Kalen recognized the stiff posture, the expensive coat, the aura of righteous indignation. It was Monique, his late wife's mother. "That's him, officers," she called out, her voice sharp and piercing, a weapon designed to cut. "He's refusing to leave my daughter's house. He has no right to be here. I want him removed." Kalen's gaze drifted from the officers to the woman who had never approved of him. Not when he was dating her daughter, not when he married her, and certainly not now that he was all that was left of the family they had started. He looked at the oak tree in the front yard, the one he and Lena had planted on their first anniversary, its branches now reaching towards the sky like a silent prayer. He looked at the porch swing where he and his 6-year-old daughter, Amira, sat every evening, her small voice a waterfall of stories about her day. He had poured the foundation of this house himself, his hands raw and his back aching. He had framed every wall, hung every sheet of drywall, laid every single floorboard. He had sawed, sanded, and stained the kitchen cabinets, his love for Lena and their unborn child a silent collaborator in every detail. The house wasn't just wood and nails, it was a testament. It was a love letter, written in timber and stone. He turned his attention back to the officers, his voice low and steady, betraying none of the storm raging inside him. "This is my home." Monique scoffed from the sidewalk. "It was my Lena's home. I'm her mother, her next of kin. This property belongs to me now. He needs to go." The officers exchanged a look. It was a messy, domestic situation, the kind they hated. Kalen saw the calculation in their eyes, the weighing of probabilities, the search for the path of least resistance. He knew what they saw: a grieving widow in a luxury car and a large black man in a doorway. But he also knew something they didn't. He knew that courage wasn't about shouting. It was about standing your ground when the world tried to wash you away. He had built this house to withstand storms, both literal and metaphorical. He would not be moved. And in that moment, as the flashing lights continued their frantic dance, he understood that a life he had carefully constructed was about to be dismantled and inspected piece by piece. His past, his present, and his future were all converging on this single, impossible night. His life, and the quiet world he had built, was about to be turned upside down. Days passed. The ghost of the flashing lights lingered long after the police cruisers had gone. The officers had left after Kalen had calmly, quietly produced the deed to the house, his name clearly printed alongside Lena's. He had also produced the original architectural plans, his own signature in the bottom right corner as the primary builder. The encounter had ended not with a bang, but with Monique's tight-lipped fury and the officers' mumbled apologies. But the damage was done. A crack had appeared in the foundation of Kalen's carefully managed peace. His life was a quiet rhythm, a melody composed for two. It started at dawn with the smell of coffee and the soft padding of Amira's feet on the hardwood floors he had installed. Amira was a sunbeam in human form, her natural hair a beautiful explosion of coils that bounced when she was excited, which was often. She was 6 years old, but she possessed the ancient, unfiltered wisdom of a child who had known loss and had chosen joy instead. "Daddy, can we have pancake mountains today?" she'd ask, climbing onto her stool at the kitchen island he had built from reclaimed barn wood. Her braids, adorned with the colorful beads he'd painstakingly learned to weave in, clicked softly against the countertop. "Pancake mountains it is," he'd say, his voice a low rumble. He'd mix the batter, his movements economical and sure. He would make them just the way Lena used to, though his were never quite as perfect. There was always one that was a little too brown, a little misshapen. Amira called these the daddy pancakes, and she always ate them first, a small act of loyalty that made his heart ache with a fierce, protective love. He was a carpenter by trade, a creator. His hands, calloused and strong, were more comfortable holding a hammer or a chisel than a pen. After Lena's death from a sudden illness that had stolen her from them like a thief in the night, his work had become his solace. He took on small, custom jobs, bookshelves, tables, intricate cabinetry, pouring his grief and his love into the grain of the wood. It was honest work. It was quiet work. It kept him grounded. It helped him be the father Amira deserved. Their evenings were for the porch swing. As the sun bled orange and purple across the sky, they would sit together, the gentle creak of the chains, a familiar lullaby. Amira would recount her day at school, her stories long, breathless, run-on sentences full of tangents about butterflies, the color of her friends' shoes, and the questionable logic of kindergarten politics. He would listen, truly listen, absorbing every detail as if it were the most important information in the world. Because to him, it was. It was on that swing that he told her stories about her mother. He pointed to the constellations Lena had taught him, told Amira how her mama had a laugh that sounded like wind chimes, how she could make any plant grow, how she loved the color yellow because it was the color of happiness. He was building a bridge of memories for his daughter, connecting her to a woman she barely remembered, but whose legacy lived in the warmth of their home and the love in her father's heart. This quiet, fragile piece was what Monique's presence threatened to shatter. She represented a world of sharp edges and cold transactions, a world that had never understood the simple, profound love he and Lena had shared. To Monique, the house was an asset, a line item on an estate. To Kalen, it was the repository of his entire life. Miles away, in a glass tower that scraped the Philadelphia skyline, Naima Sterling stared at a different kind of blueprint. It was a quarterly earnings report, a sea of numbers and projections that governed her world. As the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar tech firm, she was one of the most powerful women in the city. Her deep brown skin was luminous, even under the harsh fluorescent lights of the boardroom, and her natural hair was styled in an elegant updo that conveyed authority and grace. She wore a tailored suit that cost more than Kalen's monthly mortgage payment, and her expression was one of controlled, impenetrable calm. But inside, Naima was tired. She was tired of the endless meetings, the political maneuvering, the weight of 1,000 expectations. Her life was a series of curated successes, each one leading not to fulfillment, but to the next, higher bar. She had a penthouse apartment with breathtaking views of the city, but it was silent and sterile, a beautiful museum she happened to sleep in. She had accolades and awards, but she had no one to share them with. Her phone buzzed. It was her mother. Naima let it go to voicemail. The message would be the same as always. A clipped inquiry about her career, a subtle reminder of the sacrifices the family had made for her education, a complete lack of any question about her happiness. She had been raised to achieve, not to feel. Vulnerability was a liability. Love was a transaction. Her company was about to launch a major philanthropic initiative, a series of community center renovations in underserved neighborhoods. It was a PR move, her board's idea of giving back. Naima was scheduled for a photo op at the first site that afternoon. She sighed, looking out at the city sprawling below. It was a world she commanded, but she had never felt more like a stranger in it. She was surrounded by people, yet utterly alone. She had built an empire, but she had no home. The community center buzzed with a chaotic energy that Naima found jarring. The air smelled of fresh paint, sawdust, and the faint aroma of coffee from a pot in the corner. Volunteers in paint-splattered clothes bustled about. Naima, in her pristine suit and heels, felt like a porcelain doll in a sandbox. Her PR manager was chattering beside her, pointing out the best angles for the photographer. Naima's eyes scanned the room, her gaze landing on a man working quietly in the corner. It was Kalen. He was on his knees, meticulously fixing the leg of a wobbly, antique table. He wore a simple gray t-shirt, jeans, and work boots, all dusted with a fine layer of sawdust. His dark brown skin glowed with a light sheen of sweat under the work lights. He was focused, his movements precise and confident. He wasn't performing for anyone. He was simply serving. Naima felt a strange, unfamiliar pang in her chest. He was from another world, a world of tangible things, of fixing what was broken with your own two hands. Her world was abstract, built on algorithms and stock prices. As she turned to move, the heel of her expensive shoe caught in a crack in the old linoleum floor. She stumbled, a sharp pain shooting up her ankle. She let out a small, involuntary gasp, her carefully constructed composure momentarily shattering. Before her PR manager could even react, Kalen was there. He moved with a quiet swiftness, one hand gently gripping her elbow to steady her. "Easy there," he said, his voice a low, calm baritone. "I'm fine," she said, her tone clipped and automatic, even as she winced. He knelt, his gaze focused on her ankle. He didn't stare or make a show of it. He was clinical, concerned. "You should put some ice on that. Stay here." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a gentle command, spoken with an authority that had nothing to do with a title or a bank account. He returned a moment later with a plastic bag full of ice wrapped in a clean dish towel and a bottle of water. He handed them to her. Their fingers brushed, and for a fleeting second, Naima was acutely aware of the warmth and calloused texture of his hand against the cold smoothness of her own. "Thank you," she said, the words feeling inadequate. She looked at him, really looked at him for the first time. He had kind eyes, deep and patient, though they held a shadow of something she recognized from the mirror, a quiet, abiding sadness. "Just helping," he said with a slight nod, already turning back to his work, leaving Naima sitting there with a bag of ice on her ankle, feeling more seen and cared for in that one small gesture than she had in years of power lunches and board meetings. The encounter at the community center lingered in Naima's mind. A few days later, acting on an impulse she didn't fully understand, she had her assistant find out the name of the lead volunteer carpenter, Kalen Carter. She needed custom bookshelves for the center's new library. It was a legitimate business need, she told herself, but she knew it was more than that. She called him directly. He was surprised, his voice wary at first, but when she described the project, the wariness was replaced by a professional focus. He agreed to meet her at the center, and he told her he'd have to bring his daughter. Amira was a whirlwind. She arrived holding her father's hand, her beaded braids bouncing, her bright eyes taking in everything. While Kaylin and Naima discussed dimensions and wood types, Amira conducted her own inspection of Naima. She walked a full circle around the powerful CEO, her head tilted. "Your face is all pinched up," she announced, with no malice, just observation. "Like you ate a sour lemon." Kaylin's face flushed. "Amira, that's not polite." But Naima, to her own surprise, laughed. A real laugh, one that started deep in her belly. It felt rusty, foreign. "She's not wrong," Naima admitted, a smile touching her lips. "It's been a sour lemon kind of week." Amira seemed to accept this. "My daddy makes sweet lemonade," she offered. "It's the best." Throughout the meeting, Naima found her attention divided. She was impressed by Kaylin's quiet expertise, the way he spoke of oak and maple, with a reverence she reserved for market caps. But she was mesmerized by the bond between him and his daughter. The way he'd unconsciously smooth down a stray braid, the way she'd lean against his leg, the easy, unspoken language of their love. It was a world away from her own sterile existence. Days turned into weeks. The bookshelf project became an excuse for more interactions. Naima found herself making trips to the community center she never would have before, just to see the progress, just to witness a few more moments of that quiet, steady world. One evening, a sudden thunderstorm broke as Kaylin was finishing the installation. Amira was with him, dozing on a pile of coats in the corner. Naima, who had been working late in the center's temporary office, saw them getting ready to leave. "You can't go out in that," she said, gesturing to the sheets of rain. "Let me give you a ride." Kaylin hesitated. "We don't want to trouble you, Miss Sterling." "It's Naima, and it's no trouble. I'm heading home anyway." The ride was quiet, the only sounds the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers and Amira's soft breathing from the back seat. Naima's luxury car had never felt so much like a sterile bubble. When they pulled up to his house, the house from the police report she vaguely registered, he turned to her. "Thank you, Naima. Can I offer you a cup of tea? To warm you up before you drive back? It's the least I can do." She should have said no. She had 1,000 emails to answer, but she heard herself say, "I'd like that very much." Inside, the house was everything her penthouse was not. It was modest, lived in, and overflowing with warmth. Crayon drawings were taped to the refrigerator. A half-finished puzzle sat on the coffee table. The air smelled of ginger and cinnamon. Kaylin carried a sleeping Amira upstairs, his movements gentle and practiced. He returned with 2 mugs of steaming tea. They sat in the living room, the storm raging outside, the house a safe, warm haven against it. They didn't talk about business or philanthropy. He asked her about her day. She found herself telling him about the sour lemon week, the pressure, the loneliness. He listened without judgment, his presence a quiet anchor in her turbulent sea. She looked around the room, at the handcrafted mantel, the sturdy rocking chair in the corner. "You have a beautiful home," she said. The words full of a sincerity that surprised her. A sad smile touched his lips. "My wife, Lena, she made it a home. I just built the walls." It was the first time he had mentioned his wife in front of her. In that shared moment of vulnerability, Naima felt a crack appear in the armor she had worn for so long. She saw the depth of his loss, and in it, she felt the echo of her own profound loneliness. She had been in penthouses, luxury spas, and corporate boardrooms all over the world. None of them had ever felt like this. None of them had felt like home. The next Saturday, Naima was at the community center for the official unveiling of the new library. The bookshelves stood tall and proud, filled with new books, their maple wood glowing in the afternoon light. Kaylin was there with Amira, standing near the back, never one for the spotlight. As the speeches droned on, Amira slipped away from her father and made a beeline for Naima. She was clutching a piece of folded construction paper. "This is for you," she said, thrusting it into Naima's hand. Naima unfolded it. On the paper was a child's drawing. It depicted 3 stick figures standing in front of a house with a big yellow sun smiling down. They were holding hands. The figures were colored in with crayon. One was a tall man with brown skin. One was a small girl with brown skin and black squiggles for hair with little dots of color in them. The third figure, standing between them, was a woman with brown skin and her hair drawn in a neat circle on top of her head. Below the drawing, in wobbly 6-year-old print, were the words, "A new family." Naima's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes burned. She had to turn away, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a sob. All her life she had earned her place. She had achieved, performed, and excelled her way into every room she'd ever entered. For the first time, someone was simply offering her a place. No strings attached, no performance required. A child's drawing had broken through decades of carefully constructed defenses. She knelt, pulling Amira into a gentle hug. The little girl wrapped her arms around Naima's neck, her beaded braids ticking against her cheek. "Do you like it?" Amira whispered. Naima pulled back, her eyes wet with tears she didn't bother to hide. "I love it," she whispered back, her voice thick with emotion. "I love it more than you can possibly imagine." Over Amira's shoulder, she saw Kalen watching them, a complex mix of hope and fear in his eyes. In that moment, she knew her life was at a crossroads. One path led back to the glass tower, to the safety of her achievements and her loneliness. The other path led here, to this messy, beautiful, uncertain world of pancake mountains and crayon drawings. For the first time in her life, she felt the courage to choose the path that led not to power, but to connection. The bond between Naima and Kalen deepened through a series of quiet, domestic moments. It was a slow, gentle courtship built not on grand romantic gestures, but on shared cups of tea, trips to the park with Amira, and long talks on the porch swing. Naima found herself rearranging her schedule, canceling pointless dinners and delegating meetings, to steal a few more hours in Kalen's world. She learned the names of Amira's friends, the story behind the scar on Kalen's knuckle, a slipped chisel, and the quiet rhythm of their life together. She, in turn, began to open up. She told him about the immense pressure from her parents, the brother she was always compared to, the gnawing feeling that her worth was tied only to her latest success. He listened, his presence a calming balm. He never offered solutions or corporate strategies. He just saw her. One evening, as they sat on the swing after putting Amira to bed, he spoke of Lena. He didn't speak of the sickness or the pain, but of the life. He talked about how they met, how she had challenged him to build his own business instead of working for others, how she had believed in him more than he believed in himself. "This house, it was her dream," he said, his voice soft in the twilight. She drew the first sketch on a napkin in a diner. She wanted a big porch, a garden for vegetables, and a room with enough light for all her plants. I tried to build her dream. Naima rested her head on his shoulder, a gesture that felt as natural as breathing. "You did more than that, Kalen," she said. "You built a sanctuary." It was in that sanctuary that Naima began to heal. The pinched, sour lemon look Amira had pointed out was replaced by a soft, genuine smile. Her tailored suits were often exchanged for jeans and comfortable sweaters. She discovered the simple joy of digging in a garden, the satisfaction of a perfectly baked loaf of bread from one of Lena's old recipes, the profound peace of reading a bedtime story to a child who had her wrapped around her little finger. But the outside world, with its sharp edges and cold realities, could not be kept at bay forever. A rival on Naima's board, a man named Henderson, who had always coveted her position, began to sow seeds of doubt. Whispers started circulating. The powerful CEO was distracted. She was spending an inordinate amount of time on a low-priority community project. She was seen in a modest neighborhood with a local contractor. The whispers reached a crescendo when a gossip blog published a grainy photo of Naima, Kaylin, and Amira at a local farmer's market. They looked like a family. The headline was snide: Billionaire CEO Naima Sterling trades boardroom for blue-collar romance. The article was cruel, filled with innuendo about Kaylin being a gold digger and Naima slumming it. But the part that made Naima's blood run cold was the mention of the police incident, painting Kaylin as a squatter in his late wife's home, with a quote from a concerned family member, Monique. Henderson called for an emergency board meeting. The agenda was vague, but the intent was clear. It was a coup. Her position, her career, everything she had worked for, was on the line. Her old instincts screamed at her: fight back, destroy him, use every weapon in her considerable arsenal. But as she sat in her silent penthouse the night before the meeting, staring at Amira's crayon drawing now framed on her bedside table, she felt a strange calm. The empire she had built suddenly seemed like a kingdom of ghosts. The only thing that felt real, the only thing that mattered, was the warmth of Kaylin's hand, the sound of Amira's laughter, the feeling of belonging she had found in their small, handcrafted world. The boardroom was a lion's den. The air was thick with tension. Henderson presented his case, couching his ambition in the language of concern for the company's image. He spoke of instability, lapses in judgment, and the unfortunate publicity. When he was finished, all eyes turned to Naima. They expected a fight, a denial, a ruthless defense of her throne. Instead, Naima stood up, her posture regal, her gaze clear and direct. She did not look at Henderson. She addressed the entire board. "Mr. Henderson is correct about one thing," she began, her voice even and strong. "I have been distracted. For years, I have been distracted by stock prices, by market share, by the relentless pursuit of more. I have allowed the bottom line to be the sole measure of my life's worth." She paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Recently, however, I was reminded of what it means to build something of true value. I met a man, a carpenter named Kaylin Carter. He built his own home with his hands. He is raising a daughter with a heart full of love and courage. He has faced loss with a dignity I can only admire. He contributes to his community not for PR, but because it is the right thing to do. The unfortunate publicity Mr. Henderson mentioned failed to report that Mr. Carter not only owns his home, he is the man who designed and built it. The complaint came from a place of grief and bitterness, not fact." She looked around the table, at the powerful men and women who had been her peers. "You are worried about the company's image. I am worried about its soul. Therefore, I am recommending a change in leadership. I am proposing that we promote Eleanor Vance to CEO. She is brilliant, capable, and her vision for the future is exactly what this company needs." A stunned silence fell over the room. Henderson's jaw was slack. "As for me," Naima continued, a true radiant smile breaking across her face, "I will be taking on a new role. I am stepping down from the board to become the full-time director of the Sterling Foundation. My first project will be to expand our community building initiatives, starting with a partnership with Carter Custom Carpentry. I've learned that a home is more than a house, and a life is more than a career. I intend to build a life." She gathered her belongings, leaving her key card on the polished table. As she walked out of the boardroom, leaving a trail of shattered expectations and stunned silence in her wake, she had never felt more powerful. She had not lost an empire. She had abdicated a throne to walk into her kingdom. She drove not to her penthouse, but to the quiet street with the oak tree. Kaelin was on the porch, sanding a piece of wood, the late afternoon sun casting a golden glow around him. He looked up as she approached, his eyes asking 1,000 questions. He had seen the news alerts. Naima didn't say a word. She walked up the steps he had built, sat down on the swing he had hung, and took the sandpaper from his hand, setting it aside. She took his large, calloused hand in her own. "I'm staying," she said softly. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, a promise. He looked at their intertwined hands, his dark and work-worn, hers smooth and elegant. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. A single tear traced a path through the sawdust on his cheek. "Welcome home," he whispered. Months later, the house was filled with a new kind of music. It was the sound of 3 people building a life. It was the sound of Naima's laughter mingling with Amira's squeals as they planted a new row of tomatoes in the garden. It was the sound of Kaelin humming an old gospel hymn as he taught Naima how to use a miter saw in his workshop. The Sterling Foundation flourished under Naima's passionate leadership, transforming communities with a model that prioritized people over profits. Kaelin's business grew, but he never took on more work than would allow him to be home for pancake mountains in the morning and porch swing stories in the evening. One perfect autumn evening, as the sun set in a blaze of glory, Amira ran onto the porch. She was holding a small, delicate bracelet woven from daisies and clover. She walked solemnly to Naima and held it out. Naima offered her wrist, and Amira carefully fastened the fragile bracelet around it. Then, Amira turned to her father, her expression serious. "Daddy," she asked, her voice clear in the quiet air, "does this mean she's staying forever?" Kaelin looked at Naima, his heart so full he felt it might burst. Her eyes were shining, reflecting the last light of the day. He didn't have a diamond ring. He didn't have a prepared speech. He had only this perfect, fragile, beautiful life they had built together. He reached out, his hand covering hers, their fingers lacing together over the daisy bracelet. He looked deep into her eyes, a silent question passing between them, a silent, joyful answer returning. "That's the plan, sweet pea," he whispered, his voice thick with love. "If she'll have us." Naima's laugh was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard, like wind chimes in a summer breeze. Tears of pure joy streamed down her face as she leaned in, her forehead resting against his. "I'll have you," she whispered back. "Forever." Family, they had learned, wasn't a house you inherit or a name you are given. It was a home you build plank by plank, with kindness and patience. It was a sanctuary you choose. And the greatest love story was not one of grand passion, but the quiet, steady truth of being seen, being known, and being welcomed home.